Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Columbia University Club here on Monday morning. Thank you, everybody, for turning out. My name is Gabriel Saya. I'm the co-executive director of the Cattell Center for Health, Equity, and Justice. We're really pleased to be here today with our partners at Columbia University Justice Lab and Cut 50 for the launch of these reports about probation and parole in the use of probation and parole in the United States today, and particularly around technical violations. And we have a fairly tight agenda that we want to keep today because we know for many of you who are reporters, we want to make sure you have an opportunity to ask the speaker questions. Let me just run through the agenda. Quickly, the bathrooms are out that room on either side of the room. Over there, there's food, there's coffee. Please help yourselves. We're going to hear from each of our speakers today. We'll hear from Van Jones from Cut 50, from Vinny Schiraldi at the Justice Lab, from Topeka Sam with Hope House, Donna Hilton from Life to Life, and Jessica Jackson from Cut 50. We're going to try to keep the presentation portion of this relatively short. Vinny will go over the research and the reports today, which you can find out at the sign-in table if you haven't picked up a copy. He'll do that through this PowerPoint, and then we're going to open this up to Q&A from the audience. We are live streaming this, and the stream of this or the video will be available afterwards. We will also be taking questions from reporters online at the end, and we'll do Q&A as long as it makes sense to do so, and then we'll wrap and get everybody out of here. Let me just say one thing briefly. We are using 3 hashtags today. Cut 50's hashtag Still Not Free, which relates to their national campaign related to these issues. The one we're launching today is part of a campaign based here in New York to try to implement some of the reforms or the recommendations that is found in Vinny's research called Less is More and Why. And then, of course, Close Rikers, because as you'll hear in Vinny's research, there's a pretty direct connection here between the problems of reincarcerating people for technical violations on probation and parole and the problem in question of Rikers and our ability to close it rapidly. So with that, let me bring up our first speaker, Van Jones from Cut 50. Van will speak, and again, please hold your questions until the end of the speakers. This portion, the presentations will run roughly 21 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A.
Good morning. It's good to be here. I want to say a couple of things about the situation in which we find ourselves. I have been working on criminal justice issues since I got out of law school in 1993, so I was woke before woke was woke. We didn't even have the term mass incarceration. We called it the prison industrial complex, which lets you know it was only about 6 of us working on it, because who would come up with a term like that? But this is not something that's new. For me, it's something that I have been shocked about my whole life, that when you talk about liberty and justice for all, conservatives care about liberty, individual rights, limited government. That principle is being completely violated. Conservative Republican principles of liberty are being completely violated by this mass incarceration crisis that we're in. Justice, liberals talk about justice. The need to make sure that the little folks aren't run over by the big folks and the weak folks aren't mistreated by the strong folk. That principle is being violated every day by the way the court system crushes people because they don't have enough money for a good lawyer, or because they come from the wrong neighborhood, or their skin color is different. So it's a bipartisan crisis. It took both political parties abandoning their core principles to get us into this mess, and it will take both political parties returning to their core principles to get us out. And that is the reason that I'm proud to work with Jessica Jackson at Cut 50. I've known, Vinny was my first mentor when I got out of law school and moved to the Bay Area back in the early 90s. And we're still fighting, we'll continue to fight. But I wanna just talk about something that happened to me this weekend. I thought this weekend, after my show, the Van Jones Show debuted, 7 o'clock on CNN, Saturday. I thought the next morning I would be able to get up, you know, go to the gym, then go violate the gym by getting some Danishes, you know, and have a Sunday. But I woke up and the President of the United States was tweeting about the interview I did with Jay-Z. And I want to say something about that. it's not just that the president missed the point of Jay-Z's remarks and went all off script talking about jobs he hasn't really created. The problem with the president's tweet about the Jay-Z interview is that the core of the Jay-Z interview was about criminal justice. The core of the Jay-Z interview was about Kalief Browder, who Jay-Z had created a documentary for. The core of the Jay-Z interview, the heart and soul of it, was him talking about a friend of his who died in jail and talking about why he's fighting so hard, why he's standing up against the abuse of people who are being trapped in the bail system and trapped in the probation system. We talked about Meek Mill. Jay-Z talked about Meek Mill and the fact that this young, promising rapper's life has been taken off course, being sent to prison for 2 years for popping a wheelie. Jay-Z, one of the biggest stars in the world who could be talking about anything and doing anything, is putting his time and his energy into trying to fix his criminal justice system. And he's not by himself. Cut 50 has worked with 30-plus A-list celebrities from Steph Curry all the way down who are passionate about this and who care about this. The world is watching this issue. The eyes of the world are on this issue, and frankly, the eyes of the world are on this state. We have a Democratic governor in this state who has a tremendous opportunity to show real leadership. There are things that just don't make any sense in New York State. And sometimes it's the little things. We talk about the big things, but there are little things like this Rule 7, which says that two people, both of whom have been incarcerated, can't talk to each other. Well, that's just stupid. I mean, like some things, that's not left or right. That's just dumb. People who've been incarcerated talk to each other all the time. They have to in different programs, in the courts. Why can't they talk to each other to help each other? Who can help you better than your peer who's a step ahead of you in line? So you're literally cutting people off from help, cutting people off from each other, cutting people off from the solidarity that you need. So when you have dumb rules like that in place and a Democratic governor who can make a difference, I call on Cuomo to do everything that he can to read these reports. You know, when Vinny Schiraldi writes a report, you can believe every word and semicolon and comma in that report because Vinny knows if he gets one thing wrong, they're going to take him to task. So these reports you can rely on, and I call on the governor to rely on it. And I leave you with this. Even though the president tweeted all off script, tomorrow night at the State of the Union, I believe you're going to hear the president say something positive about this issue. I know for a fact that Jared Kushner, whose father went to prison, is passionate about this issue. The news media didn't cover it as much as we should have, but conservatives who care about this issue have been meeting with this president thanks to Jared Kushner. So I hope that even though the president's tweet missed the mark and took us away from criminal justice, that his remarks tomorrow night will get us back on track. If there's one issue that can bring us all back together, it's getting both political parties to deal with both of our core principles and end this American tragedy of mass incarceration together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Van. Van mentioned, brought into the room the name of Kalief Browder, and I just wanted to mention that Kalief's brother, Akeem Browder, who's the president of the Kalief Browder Foundation, is here today, and just thank him for being here with us, and thank you, Van, for raising that story. I'd like to ask Vinny Schiraldi, he's the senior research scientist at the Columbia University Justice Lab, to come up and walk us through these reports.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Van for that great opening and just sort of remind everybody what one of the particular things he said is, which is the world is watching us on this. And I think that unless we get our act together on it, posterity is going to treat us very poorly. We can't say we didn't know, that's for sure. And also fellow participants today, Topeka, Gabriel for emceeing, and Donna and Jessica. I want to thank my report co-author, Jennifer Arzu. Are you out there, Jennifer? Well, she's out there doing her work, but Jennifer co-authored the New York report, and then 20 probation and parole commissioners signed on to the national report, some of the leading folks in the field. So I want to thank all of those folks. I'm going to start with a person that Van mentioned, Meek Mill. I'm going to hit you with a lot of graphs and charts shortly, and sometimes numbers can be numbing, but prisons and jails and probation and parole are not full of numbers, they're full of real people. I ran the probation department for New York City. I ran the juvenile justice system for Washington, D.C., which meant I was in charge of juvenile parole. There were no numbers on my caseload. They were people. They were young people. They were old people. They feel real pain. They really suffer. They live real lives. They have hopes and aspirations. We need to remember that as we go through this. Meek Mill is not a number. Meek Mill is not a metaphor. And unfortunately, Meek Mill is not alone. So now to the numbers. You can see the really enormous number of people on probation. This high chart here is the number of people and the growth of the number of people on probation since 1980. It's been about a fourfold growth on probation. When you add probation and parole together, parole's this gray line down here. It comes up to around 5 million, 4.7 million to be exact. Just to put 4.7 million people into context, that's 1 out of every 53 adults in America. It's more people than live in half of the states in the United States. Half of the United States don't have 4.7 million people in them. It's not distributed equally across the population, of course, like so much else in the criminal justice system. It falls disproportionately on people of color. So 1 out of 12 African-American men is under probation or parole. 1 out of 5 African-American men who are young and who have not finished high school is on probation and parole. The call to reduce the number of people on probation and parole, the call to reduce technical violations, to eliminate fines and fees for people on probation and parole that our report is coming out with today. We're not alone in that. This is mainstream thought in the community corrections field, which is really unusual. The community corrections field is saying we should have half as many people in our system. It's not just some crazy guy like Van Jones, right? It's not just Jay-Z. It's not just basketball players and celebrities who know somebody who just got locked up. The field is saying there's too many people on probation and parole. As these numbers occurred, as this growth occurred, 9 out of every $10 went to prisons, even though twice as many people were on probation and parole. So now what you have is you have folks who are supposed to supervise people and help them, probation and parole officers who worked for me, who have hundreds of people on their caseloads, some of whom are homeless, some of whom have mental health problems, some of whom have substance abuse problems, need jobs, and they're overwhelmed because there's no resources to help those people with. So they may not have enough time to help an individual, but what they have enough time to do is write a violation report and send a person back to prison. And in a risk-averse environment, a politically risk-averse environment, far too many of them do that. So what happens now is that 4 out of every 10 people locked up in jail and prison in America were on probation and parole at the time they got locked up. So, as I said, back to here, this is mainstream thought now. The Harvard Executive Session on Community Corrections that was chaired by my colleague Bruce Western over there. Bruce, raise your hand. There's Bruce. Had brought together 29 experts, scholars, probation and parole commissioners, law enforcement, legal experts, formerly incarcerated people, and they said, shrink probation, make it better, get rid of the fines, stop violating so many people. In August, a statement on the future of community corrections was issued. It was signed on to by 35 probation and parole commissioners from around the country and every major probation and parole association, the American Probation and Parole Association, National Association of Parole Executives, on and on and on, signed on, and it said, probation and parole used to be the solution. They used to be, as Van said, alternatives to incarceration. Now they are major feeders to incarceration, violating people for ticky-tack fouls and contributing to mass incarceration. It should be shrunk. We should stop finding people. We should stop revoking them. And then Too Big to Succeed, the report we're releasing today, is signed on to by 20 probation and parole commissioners around the country. It says, cut the population of people on probation and parole in half. So that was the national study. We also did a New York study, and we'll soon be rolling out studies in other states. Pennsylvania will probably be next because of the Meek Mill case. The great thing about New York is that, as Van pointed out, state and city leaders agree that Rikers Island should be closed, and state and city leaders agree that the parole violation population is part of that equation. So, for example, in his 2018 State of the State address, Governor Cuomo said, quote, 33% of individuals released in 2012 were returned to prison within 3 years due to technical parole violations. New York jails and prisons should not be filled with people who may have violated the conditions of their parole but present no danger to our communities. That was Governor Cuomo. Likewise, Mayor de Blasio said, quote, let's do the fair thing and allow community supervision when appropriate while detaining only the high-risk people who have violated parole in one of 3 state facilities right here in the 5 boroughs. That fix alone would allow us to close another jail on Rikers Island right now. Despite the fact that there's agreement at the state and city level, the only population increasing in Rikers Island are people in on parole violations. So you can see this is statewide. There was a 10% increase in people in jail in New York State on parole violations. It was almost 20% in New York City and about 5% in the rest of the state. And then this graph is the most telling graph in the paper. Every population in New York City's jails, including Rikers Island, is declining by double digits. You can see it's an overall 21% decline, sentenced, pretrial people in on violent felonies, on nonviolent felonies, on misdemeanors, all down by double digits. The only population up, and up by 15%, are technical parole violators. If you look at the whole population of people in Rikers Island, it makes up almost 1 in 6 of the folks in Rikers Island. And they're not in on terribly serious offenses. 81% of them, 4 out of 5, are either on a technical violation, a misdemeanor arrest, or a nonviolent arrest. Only 19% are in on violent felony arrests. So what are we going to do about this? We put out a variety of recommendations in our New York State report, less is more, shorten parole terms and incentivize good behavior. Parole and probation were never meant to be 11 years like they were for Meek Mill. That's crazy to be supervised by it for that amount of time. Anybody who's supervised for that amount of time, if you look hard enough at any of you, at any of us, you'd find stuff over an 11-year period of time, and supervision, the impact of supervision wanes after about a year or two, and after that it's just a waste of money and a waste of time, and it serves as an unnecessary tripwire back to incarceration. Require a hearing before you jail somebody on a technical violation. You shouldn't be able to just put the handcuffs on somebody and take them straight to jail. It's too easy. And when you make things easy for risk-averse, overburdened bureaucracies, they do bad stuff with that. Not because they're bad people, but because they're just managing too many people with too many problems, and they know that they'll never get in trouble for putting somebody in jail, but if they take a chance on somebody and it doesn't work out, that's when they get called on the carpet. Create a high legal threshold for jailing people on parole. There are a lot of calls, rightly, for bail reform. Stop locking people up who haven't been convicted of a new crime, who are too poor to get out. We need to extend that to people on parole. And then problem-solving hearings. It shouldn't just be about guilt or innocence. It shouldn't just be about, did you come up with a dirty urinalysis? It should be, what are we going to do about this? You have a drug problem. You don't have a place to live. It's not just you did it or you didn't do it. It's what can we as a society do to help you make it through this transitional period. Require graduated responses and cap violation terms. These are both sort of the same theme. There's tons of evidence that it's the certainty of holding people accountable that affects their behavior the best, not the severity. So a 1-week return to jail gives you as much of a jolt to somebody and a wake-up call as a 2-year one, except a 2-year one uproots people from all of the things they have supporting them. So if you have graduated responses, including graduated incentives that incentivize good behavior and more supervision or more programming, those kinds of things will help nudge people in the right direction way better than a 2 to 4 year sentence back in jail. And then finally, this is going to save a lot of money. And the folks on probation and parole very often need expensive help, like housing. Housing is a huge issue for people on probation and parole. We should be able to help with supportive housing for folks that are out there not making it and living in cardboard boxes, not expensive and debilitating reincarceration. Here's how to read the reports. Here's a bunch of hashtags I don't fully understand. I'm done.
Thank you, Vinny. So for folks who, if there's any empty seats where folks are sitting, will you please raise your hand? There may not be. So if people could scoot in, because we do have some folks that want to enter the room, and so we got a packed house today. With that, we're going to hear a couple brief remarks from 3 other speakers here, and then we're going to move into the Q&A. I'd like to invite up Topeka Sam. She's the founder and director of Hope House, which is a reentry home that's launched in the Bronx. But she is also an Open Society Foundation's fellow for a project called the Probation and Parole Accountability Project, which is doing a national survey looking at a lot of these issues. Ms. Sam?
Thank you. Good morning. Well, first I want to thank Catal, Cut 50, Vinny, the Columbia Justice Lab for having us here, Donna, my co-panelist, to understand the importance of directly impacted people, speaking from our lived experience and also shaping policy recommendations. I'm here supporting this release today and the work that is beginning to happen and be done by the authors to expose the way the systems of probation and parole cause harm and drive people back into prison, other than helping us transition back into society and to be full productive citizens. I'm presently on federal supervision or probation, and I've applied for early termination of sentence, which I'm presently awaiting for a judicial response on. But in my experience on probation, right now, it's been so challenging, and as Vinny pointed out, the 4.7 million people who are currently on probation or parole have experienced hardships, surveillance, and negative intrusions into not only their lives, but their families' lives. And I have lived with constant threat of being returned to prison for arbitrary and petty reasons. I received little help with reentry, no resources from probation when I got home, and the more I talked with others in the same situation, the more I found that my experiences were systemic. And so I created a project called, with the help of my Soros Justice Fellowship, called the Probation and Parole Accountability Project. And as also Vinny pointed out, double the amount of people on probation or parole than there are in our US prison systems currently. And there are it's very little levels of accountability measures being put on these probation and parole officers. And so it's challenging how huge the law and law enforcement bureaucracies administer with little accountability, control, and impede the successful reentry of formerly incarcerated and convicted individuals. And so there's probation in every state, and there's also federal supervision in every state that there's probation. And yet, excuse me, it's supposed to be a lesser surveillance, and it was actually put in lieu of incarceration, but in effect, it extends incarceration for individuals on it, and it furthers the policing in our communities. And as this report clearly states, probation is another arm of the criminal justice system and is one of the key drivers of mass incarceration. And so in doing my project, this dovetails with the conclusions of the report, and I want to empower women and men on probation and parole to know their rights, so that they can defend themselves from arbitrary abuse of probation officers. I want to end the arbitrary and retaliatory violations against people on probation and parole. I want to create mechanisms and procedures where parole officers and probation officers are held accountable and working in the interests of their clients. And very specifically, I want to end the very cruel, harmful, and retaliatory parole and probation provision that prohibits formerly incarcerated and convicted individuals, as Van pointed out, from communicating, helping each other, fraternizing with each other, living with each other. It's antiquated, it's outdated, and it just needs to go. And so to do these things, it'll take a cultural and political C that includes challenging the roots of incarceration, including racism, that is the underpinning of the whole system. And given the increasing unconstitutional repressive conditions throughout the criminal justice system under this session's Justice Department, this report could not be more on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sam. Now I'd like to ask Donna Hilton to come up. She's the founder of Life to Life. She is also an author who has a book that's about to come out. And Donna's been, she's widely known as a speaker and organizer and advocate for reform issues, particularly for women coming home and women who are still in prison. Ms. Hilton?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm so honored to be here with you. So I want to make you a little uncomfortable. That's what I do, right? Because we become so comfortable in things we believe to be normal, and they should not be normal. So, good morning again. My name is Donna Hilton. I'm formerly known as inmate 86G0206. I spent 27 years in New York State's maximum security prison for women. And today I want to ask you to question why the incarcerated parolee population in New York has increased by 25% from 2015 to 2016. Why in November of 2017, there were 1,460 people incarcerated in New York City for parole violations, which means 16% of that city of Rikers Island contained parole violators. And I want to ask you to consider the 3,000 women in New York State prisons and the over 219,000 women across the country who remain incarcerated and have learned to live with this abuse because no one is bringing attention to this population. And what abuse must feel like for women whose voices have been stripped by years of abuse, drug addiction, lack of mental health care, lack of adequate housing, lack of employment, and lack of child care, complete lack. I ask you to question why long periods of incarceration and re-incarceration for inadequate and non-existing resources and alternatives continue to be the responses. And why are Black women, who represent 30% of all incarcerated women, but we are only 13% of the entire United States population? And I ask you to think about one of the most psychologically, emotionally, sexually, and physically abusive places that no one is talking about, a woman's prison. Think about the 90% of women and girls who enter the criminal justice system, who have been victims and are victims of abuse and violence. Have we really considered these statistics, these facts? The responses should not be reincarceration or violations that continue to perpetuate abuse and violence. The systemic alternative of incarceration is inhumane. So I ask you instead to focus on humane alternatives. Alternatives such as mine, From Life to Life, an initiative I created which encapsulates my philosophy, my experience, my work as an activist, a speaker, a reentry specialist, and an author, to reverse the alarming and ever-increasing rate at which women and girls of color are being incarcerated and their communities damaged. And my commitment extends to the development of pathways for safe and successful reentry for women and girls. And I also ask you to consider community alternatives like Exodus Transitional Community, a nonprofit in East Harlem that has a committed staff that believes in the value of each person walking out of prison into its doors, and a firm belief in human resilience, because we are resilient, and delivers innovative programming tailored to adults and youth affected by our system. I ask you to become uncomfortable.
Thank you, Ms. Hilton. Our final speaker is Jessica Jackson. She's the National Director from Cut 50, and after her remarks, we'll open this up to Q&A.
All right, good morning, everybody. Good morning. So, as Gabe said, I'm the National Director of Cut 50, but I actually come to this issue from a bunch of different angles. First, my personal experience. When I was 22, my own husband was locked up, and I went through the next 3.5 years learning all about the criminal justice system from an angle I'd never wish on anybody. Second, my professional experience. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. And third, And probably most importantly for this issue is my experience as an elected public official in Mill Valley. You see, I was former mayor and now city council member in Mill Valley, so I understand the public safety aspect of this issue. When I first started learning about probation and parole, I came into this with the understanding most people have. It's a system created to keep us safer, right? Wrong. There's nothing within the reentry process, nothing within our mass incarceration system that actually makes us safer, because there's nothing that actually addresses the underlying reason why people are getting in trouble in the first place, why they're making the decisions they are. There's nothing that addresses addiction. There's nothing that addresses mental health issues. There's nothing that addresses poverty and the lack of opportunities and lack of educational opportunities for most people. So as an elected official, I would second the call that's been made on the governor and many elected officials across the country, all of them, to look at the system that we have set up, to recognize that we're not making our communities safer. Instead, we're actually breaking them. How many of you guys have ever been late to a meeting? I mean, I'm late every day, everywhere. I'm known for it. How many of you have been late on a bill? Again, talk to the student loan folks, late every month. These are not offenses that should send somebody back to prison, yet for some reason, 61,000 people in this country are sitting behind bars right now, away from their families, away from their jobs, away from any sort of situation where they could possibly start succeeding and building their life back because of minor violations like that. Minor violations like not paying a bill on time, showing up to a meeting late, in Meek's case, popping a wheelie. So I would implore every elected official in this country to take a good, strong look at what you're doing in your community to help people reenter, and whether or not your probation and parole systems are just triggering a mass supervision leading to mass incarceration. Cut 50 is excited to launch the Still Not Free campaign. It's being led by Shaka Sangor on our staff and Michael Mendoza, both of whom know exactly what it's like to be on parole from their own personal experiences. I'm proud to say that when Michael came to me last year and told me that he had nowhere to go on Thanksgiving because he couldn't go down to see his parents because of the travel radius imposed by his parole, I welcomed the opportunity for him to write a bill and for Cut 50 to introduce it last week, AB 1940 in California. We've talked a little bit about bipartisan issues and how this is a bipartisan issue. When Michael first submitted that bill to Ledge Council, I got a call saying 3 Republicans wanted to get on it in California. I had to go back and read that bill. I thought we had done something wrong here. But it turns out both sides can agree that it's not smart to keep somebody from being able to go home and visit their parents for Thanksgiving, from cutting them off from their only support system, their nuclear family. It's not smart to keep them on lifetime parole like Michael is. Instead, we need to incentivize people, give them opportunities to continue their rehabilitation outside, give them the support they need, and also let them get off of parole and probation so they can go on and become regular people like you and I and have an opportunity to succeed. So as part of our Still Not Free campaign, we've actually partnered with the Parole and Probation Accountability Project and are launching a national survey. Shonda Chapman-Brown, who's the research and policy analyst, can actually speak to it better than me, so I'll yield my last minute to you, but thank you guys very much.
Good morning. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm especially excited about this project. From the standpoint of a researcher, I understand the importance of storytelling and the ability of stories to create lasting and sustainable change. And from the perspective of someone who's been directly impacted, someone who's experienced probation, I understand the importance of having directly impacted people lead that work. The Probation and Parole accountability project survey does exactly that. It's a project that is conceived, it's created, and it's implemented by directly impacted people. The main purpose is to understand the experiences and the attitudes of people on probation and parole, with the special emphasis of understanding the facilitators and barriers of success. And not just understanding that, but moving the idea of success beyond just recidivism. We also want to get a sense of, Vinny talked about the technical violations, so some of the things that people are being violated for, their experiences with their probation officers, things like that. So we're super excited about the project, and I can't wait to get that data to you guys.
Thank you. So just another quick round of applause for the speakers, and then we'll go into Q&A, please. We had Van talk to us a bit about that this is not a partisan issue. There are bipartisan solutions here to be found that are rooted in the principles of wherever somebody lands on the political spectrum. Vinny walked us through the research we heard from Topeka and Donna, not just about the severity of the impact of these policies currently, but also the institutionalized racism and the gender bias and the violence that goes along with that. And I can say on a personal experience that when my brother came home from federal prison, was on supervised release, both the rudeness that we were treated as a family, but also the experience that he went through coming home was an alarming experience. And we always understood that as white people, we were probably being treated much better than were other people. And certainly it was not widespread in our community. And then we heard Jessica talk about the new campaign that they're launching. And I forgot your name, Miss. And Shonda talked about the survey that she's going to be leading. And so with that, we're going to open this up for Q&A. I'm sure there's a lot of questions in the room by everyone, but we do want to prioritize first the reporters in the room to make sure this story gets out. So are there any reporters in the room that have questions? And you could just put your hand up and say what outlet you're with. And we also have some folks online. So if you're watching online, you're a reporter, you want to ask a question, you're welcome to submit that through the channel there. Yes? The question was, what kind of technical violations are landing people back at Rikers, and what is the average amount of time people are spending when they're there?
Okay, so we don't have a breakdown of what technicals they're in for, but typical is absconding or failing to report to your parole officer, as folks mentioned, associating with other people with criminal records, and dirty urinalysis, using drugs. Those are kind of the classic technical violations. The folks that were in for technical violations were spending about 2 months, and that's not 2 months punishment. That's 2 months before their case gets resolved. That's what they do in a local jail. Then when their case gets resolved, about 2/3 of them are going to prison for a period of time I don't know, and 1/3 of them are going out. The administrative law judge decided they didn't need to be incarcerated. So that kind of raises a question, which is, if it takes 2 months to make that decision, did they ever need to be incarcerated? And that's kind of why, part of the reason why one of our recommendations is hold that hearing right up front. If the person doesn't need to be incarcerated, why uproot them from their home, from their job, from their families, from all their support networks, so that 2 months from now you can decide they really didn't need to be incarcerated at all?
Other questions? We can just open this up now for anybody who'd like to ask. Yes, miss?
Yes, my name is Dr. Donna Hilton, former executive director of state parole, now retired, so I get a chance to speak. I just have a statement. I think one of the problems that is happening at parole is that, one, they have the wrong people sitting at the table trying to talk about what's going on in the field, for the simple fact that if we're still talking about technical violations, and as Kathy mentioned while you were talking, Vincent, that people are losing jobs, homes, kids, everything, for the parole officer to make a mistake and say, I'm going to violate you. However, parole officers don't function by themselves. They have to get a signature from a bureau chief or somebody higher. And one of the things that I know for a fact is that parole officers do not feel like they're supported when they want to make certain type of decisions. A lot of times they don't want to violate. But because somebody's lazy, somebody doesn't want to make that trip to an Edgecombe or to a Queensboro, it's easier violate and go straight to Rikers because there is no way. The other thing I wanted to say also is that we have to understand that, I think it was Van Jones that mentioned about politics. A lot of what's going on is because people in the community are stopping certain actions to being done. As Topeka knows firsthand with her Hope House issue, you know, the community doesn't have a clue about people coming home from prison. They don't have a clue about reentry, but our politicians are very quick to say, tough on crime, and everybody backs that up, not realizing that it's not about more police on the street, it's about more individuals in the penitentiary.
We had a question from Akeem.
Yes, hi, I'm Akeem Browner with the College Brother Foundation. Thanks for having us all here. I had a question for the panel just regarding statistically in New York State, if we're only talking about one jail, but I'd like to get a sense of New York State's numbers as far as how many people on, or at least ratio is how many people on parole or probation that sees reentry or that sees the recidivism.
Yeah, so as the governor said in his statement, about a third of people are revoked just on technical violations within 3 years of being released, and almost all of them go back to prison by first being detained in their local county jail. And all of those numbers went up. It's very unusual because crime is going down, jail populations are going down, prison populations are going down, but technical violators are going up. And sometimes I think that is politically motivated. I kind of think it's growing like a weed in the yard right now. It's almost untended. And that's why, you know, Van had many times, and Jessica had several times had said to me, like, there's not enough attention being paid to this by advocates or researchers, frankly, for that matter. We need to pay more attention to this issue because this is 4 in 10 people going to prison and jail in America. It's not some trivial little number, and it's 1 in 5 young black males who haven't finished high school. So in the black community, it's really focused. It's the African-American population. There was that one-day snapshot that you gave the data on in November. On that same day, African-Americans were locked up for parole violations at Rikers Island at 12.4 times the rate of whites. So this is having a very deep and focused effect on the African-American community, and in ways that I don't think are fully understood. And I think the advocacy community, although now that Catal's on our side on this and other folks, I think it'll get more attention, and hopefully something good will happen. Just one other thing I want to say. I'm super sorry for your loss, and I'm really glad you've taken on this issue.
It was just a follow-up to the response with this, because we do know the recidivism rate for technical crime, technical violations, but the reentry as well as the thought given to the rehabilitation is what one, the College Brother Foundation, what we're focused on, coming up with different means and methods to make sure that population does have a chance to stay home. And so the social emotional learning curve is not being given much thought to. And so this is what we're focused on, which is we created different means to actually keep the lines of communication for those returning citizens and the returning population to stay home. But I don't feel the government is actually looking at the rehabilitation efforts as opposed to looking at how we can keep our communities safe.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's a lot more that can be done, but I'd like others to go.
I want to say something. So let's try to look at it in what's really going on in maybe a more visual way. So I have people that I work with that are inside. They have been violated. I just spoke to someone when we were outside, when we were talking, someone who called me from the Dutchess County Jail. And we have people on parole who have been laden with so many constraints and so many stipulations that it's hard to manage. It is hard to deal with. It is just simply hard. I have so many people, right, women and men, who have called me or told me they were getting violated because they jumped a turnstile because they simply did not have a Metro card. And so how do you expect someone to get to even to parole to report if they don't have car fare because they can't get get employment because no one will hire them, and then the shelter won't give them anything. They don't even give them food. So a lot of these shelters don't even have food to sustain people in that context. So we have to understand that these things that we take for granted, and not me, because 27 years, obviously, that's not taken for granted, right? But we have to understand what happens within the community when we are released. It is not easy, and especially for people who have served an exorbitant amount of time. It is not easy. It is very difficult, and doors continue to be slammed, shut in our faces, and then you ask us to do so many things. You ask us to do so many things. It is difficult to do these things, and no one is helping. No one is getting that. So I just wanted to be clear. That's as simple as it could be, just trying to get on the train, just to make parole, or just to go try to see your child, or just to go somewhere to do something that you're mandated to do.
Topeka, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, there's just giving an example, and then also to kind of launch off of what Donna was saying. There was a sister who was violated because she was walking her dog, and she walked her dog outside of the proximity of where her, because sometimes when you're released on probation or parole, you're on home monitor. And so because she went off of her property, they actually violated her and sent her back to prison for walking her dog. So, I mean, it's these small things that you would never think that, right? But how retarded, I'm sorry, is that to send someone back to prison for walking their dog? Literally, relieving their dog at 4 o'clock in the morning. But also, what Donna said, there are no resources that we are actually given unless other formerly incarcerated people are really giving us those resources. For example, myself, as I stated, being on federal supervision, no one said, Topeka, you should go here, or you should do this. It was other formerly incarcerated people who had done work, who told me, hey, apply for Columbia for Beyond the Bars Fellowship. And then from that opportunity came Justice and Education Scholars. It was, hey, go here, and why don't you apply to do this? You want to start an organization? Go to this foundation because they support the work that formerly incarcerated people are leading. But without that network, it would have never happened. And then housing, as Dr. Seward had said, we started a house for women coming home in the Bronx. And the community, not in my backyard. Here we are in 2018 in communities of color where we have internalized racism, where people don't want you to live, not even in the Bronx. And yet, we're asking the elected officials, like, hey, how can you help us with that? And they're like, hey, what you're doing is great, but not in this homeowners community. So, and then it turns to voting, Formerly incarcerated people, we are a voting bloc. I mean, yes, people on parole cannot vote, but those of us on federal supervision and on state probation can vote. And I think that if we begin to start mobilizing around this issue and starting to get our people to the polls as well, then we will be able to really make policy change and put our people in office so that we can have housing and resources from the ground up.
I think we're going to wrap here just to move folks out. So 2 quick things, because the action step here is a great way to wrap. In addition to the Cut 50 national campaign, still not free, we are launching today Less is More New York, which is to implement the recommendations from the report. We're happy to partner with Columbia on this and work with Cut 50 here and others in the room. Valdez Heron is a community organizer back there. Stand up, Valdez, who with Catal. For anybody who wants to be involved, talk to Valdez at the end. He'll be the point person on it with his own experiences with probation. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks for the viewers online. I want to do another round of applause and thanks to our speakers. And we have the room for about 35 more minutes, and so people can stay and mingle, and the easiest place to do that is probably going to be out there near the coffee and food. Thank you all for coming out this morning.
Always buy food. Don't tell Van then. Yeah, we're so